October 14, 1962. 11:47 p.m. WWRL radio station, 125th Street. Johnny Davis sat behind the glass booth, cigarette smoke curling under the dim studio lights. He was riding high. His late-night show had pulled the biggest numbers in 3 years. Advertisers were calling. His agent was talking about a syndication deal in Chicago. And he was about to make the mistake of his life. You know what Harlem needs? Johnny leaned into the microphone, his voice smooth and confident. Harlem needs to stop worshiping old men who think they still run things. His producer, Marcus, looked up from the control board. His hand hovered over the commercials button. Johnny didn't notice. He was in the zone. Bumpy Johnson, he continued, drawing out the name like it was something he found on the bottom of his shoe. That relic walking around like he's still king of this neighborhood. Man hasn't done anything relevant in a decade. He's a dinosaur. A walking fossil collecting protection money from people too scared to say no. Marcus stood up. He was shaking his head, slicing his hand across his throat. Cut it. End the segment. Go to commercial. Johnny waved him off. I'm serious, Harlem. Why are we still pretending this man matters? Because he knew some people back in the day? Because he did some things 30 years ago? That's not power. That's just old stories. And frankly, I'm tired of pretending otherwise. The phone lines lit up. All 6 extensions. Blinking red in synchronized panic. Marcus grabbed the handset on line 3. Listen for 5 seconds. His face went pale. He scribbled something on a piece of paper and pressed it against the glass. Bumpy's nephew was on line 1. Johnny glanced at it. Shrugged. Took another drag from his cigarette. Tell him I'll take requests after the break, he said off mic. Then back to the audience. We'll be right back after these messages. And maybe by then, someone can explain to me why we're still scared of ghosts. He hit the commercial button himself. Marcus walked into the booth. His hands were trembling. You don't understand what you just did. Johnny laughed. Relax. It's radio. I say provocative things. That's the job. Not about him. You don't talk about him like that. Not on air. Not anywhere. Who's going to do something about it? He's 70 years old. Marcus set down his clipboard. He'd worked at WWRL for 12 years. He had a wife. 2 daughters. A mortgage in Queens. I can't be here when this falls apart, he said quietly. You're overreacting. No. Marcus pulled off his headset. I'm surviving. He walked out of the studio. He didn't take his coat. He didn't log out of the board. He just left. Johnny sat alone in the booth. Around him, the phone lines kept flashing. Red. 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 He didn't answer a single one. Outside, on 125th Street, someone was already making a phone call. Not to the station. To an apartment on Edgecombe Avenue. Where Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson was sitting in his chair, listening to the radio. He hadn't moved. He hadn't said a word. But his wife, Mamie, saw his jaw tighten. She saw his fingers drum once against the armrest. And she knew. Something had been set in motion that couldn't be stopped. The call came to Reggie Foster at 12:04 a.m. Reggie was 28 years old. He worked as a courier, running packages, messages, and occasionally cash between the people who mattered in Harlem and the people who wanted to matter. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid better than the factory jobs, and it kept him close to the network. Close enough to survive. Not close enough to get burned. He picked up on the third ring. Reggie. The voice was calm. Too calm. You know the radio man. Johnny Davis. Reggie's stomach dropped. He did know him. They'd gone to the same high school. Played basketball in the same park. Johnny had been the loud one, the charming one, the guy everyone said was going places. I know him. Good. Tomorrow morning. 9 a.m. You're going to deliver something to him. Reggie sat up in bed. His wife, Clara, stirred beside him but didn't wake. What am I delivering? A message. Reggie waited. The silence stretched. Just a message? For now. The line went dead. Reggie sat in the darkness of his bedroom, staring at the phone in his hand. Clara's medical bills were stacked on the dresser. 3 months of treatments for her kidney condition. The hospital wanted $200 by the end of the week or they'd stop her dialysis. He'd been promised that money. A bonus. For staying reliable. For keeping his mouth shut. For being useful. But useful men didn't say no. At 7:30 a.m., Reggie stood outside a brownstone on Edgecombe Avenue. He'd been here before. Twice. Both times to deliver envelopes he didn't open. The door opened before he knocked. A man in his 50s, built like a linebacker gone to seed, nodded him inside. Reggie followed him through a narrow hallway into a sitting room. Bumpy Johnson was eating breakfast. Eggs. Toast. Coffee. The newspaper spread open in front of him. He didn't look up. Sit down, Reggie. Reggie sat. His palms were sweating. Bumpy took a sip of coffee. Folded the newspaper. Set it aside. Finally, he looked at Reggie. You know Johnny Davis? Yes, sir. You trust him? Reggie hesitated. We grew up together. That's not what I asked. Reggie swallowed. I don't know if I trust him. He's ambitious. He talks a lot. He talked last night. I heard. Bumpy leaned back in his chair. His eyes were calm. Almost kind. That's what made it terrifying. I'm not angry, Reggie. You understand that? Reggie nodded, though he didn't believe it. I'm not angry because anger is for people who've been surprised. And I'm not surprised. Men like Johnny, they always do this. They get a little success, a little spotlight, and they think the rules don't apply to them anymore. Bumpy picked up his coffee again. Took another slow sip. What I need from you is simple. You're going to go see Johnny this morning. You're going to give him an envelope. And you're going to tell him it's an invitation. An invitation to what? Lunch. Tomorrow. At Red Rooster. 1 p.m. Reggie blinked. That's it? That's it. Bumpy stood. The conversation was over. Reggie stood too, but he couldn't help himself. The question came out before he could stop it. What if he doesn't come? Bumpy looked at him for a long moment. Then you'll deliver a different message the day after. Reggie left the brownstone with the envelope in his jacket pocket. He stood on the corner of 145th and Edgecombe, breathing in the cold October air. His hands were still shaking. Clara needed that money. The hospital needed it by Friday. That was 3 days away. If he delivered this envelope, he stayed in the network. He stayed useful. He got paid. But Johnny was his friend. Reckless, stupid, arrogant Johnny, but still his friend. And Reggie knew what an invitation from Bumpy Johnson really meant. It wasn't a lunch. It was a test. And if Johnny failed it, Reggie would be the one who led him to the slaughter. He stood on that corner for 10 minutes. Then he started walking toward the radio station. What he didn't know was that someone else had already been sent to watch him. Reggie found Johnny at a diner on Amsterdam Avenue. 9:15 a.m. Johnny was holding court at a corner booth, surrounded by 3 younger guys who hung on his every word. He was talking about the syndication deal, about how New York was just the beginning, about how he was going to be the next Jocko Henderson. When he saw Reggie, his face lit up. "Reggie! My man! Sit down, sit down." Reggie didn't sit. He stood at the edge of the booth, hands in his pockets. "I need to talk to you. Alone." Johnny's smile faltered. He glanced at his audience, then back at Reggie. "Yeah, sure. Give us a minute, fellas." The 3 guys slid out of the booth and moved to the counter. Johnny leaned back, arms spread across the top of the seat. "What's going on? You look like somebody died." Reggie pulled out the envelope. Set it on the table between them. Johnny stared at it. Didn't touch it. "What is this?" "An invitation. Lunch tomorrow. Red Rooster. 1 p.m. Johnny's face went still. "From who?" "You know from who." For 5 seconds, Johnny didn't move. Then he picked up the envelope, turned it over in his hands, and laughed. It was a short, brittle sound. "He wants to have lunch with me? After what I said? That's what the message is. This is a setup." "Probably." Johnny tossed the envelope back onto the table. "Then tell him no." Reggie sat down now. He leaned in close, keeping his voice low. "Johnny, listen to me. You don't tell him no. You don't ignore this. You show up, you apologize, and you move on with your life." "Apologize?" Johnny's voice rose. "For what? For telling the truth? For saying what everyone in Harlem is already thinking?" "No one is thinking that." "Yes, they are. They're just too scared to say it." Reggie rubbed his face. He could feel the weight of the envelope in his jacket, the weight of Clara's hospital bills, the weight of every choice that had led him to this moment. "You think this is about being right?" Reggie said quietly. "This isn't about right or wrong. This is about survival. I'm not afraid of an old man." "Then you're an idiot." Johnny stood up. His jaw was set. "You know what, Reggie? I appreciate you coming down here. I do. But I'm not playing this game. I said what I said. If he's got a problem with it, he can call me himself. He doesn't call people, Johnny." "Then I guess we're done here." Reggie stood too. He wanted to grab Johnny by the collar. "Shake him. Make him understand. But he didn't. He just picked up the envelope and put it back in his pocket. You're making a mistake. No, Johnny said. I'm making a choice. And it's mine to make. Reggie walked out of the diner. He didn't look back. Outside, Reggie stood on the sidewalk and lit a cigarette with shaking hands. He'd done what he was told. He'd delivered the message. Johnny had refused. Which meant tomorrow, someone else would be sent. And that someone wouldn't be carrying an envelope. Reggie started walking back toward Edgecombe Avenue. He had to report what happened. That was the job. But halfway there, he stopped. He stood on the corner of 138th and St. Nicholas, the envelope still in his pocket, and he realized something. He could lie. He could go back to Bumpy and say Johnny agreed. Say he'd be at Red Rooster tomorrow at 1 p.m. Buy Johnny 24 hours to come to his senses, to leave town, to do something other than walk into a death sentence. It would be easy. One lie. One day. But if Johnny didn't show up tomorrow, Bumpy would know Reggie lied. And then it wouldn't just be Johnny who paid the price. Reggie thought about Clara. About the hospital bills. About the $200 he was supposed to get on Friday. He thought about Johnny, sitting in that diner, so sure of himself, so convinced that the rules didn't apply to him. And he made his choice. At 11 a.m., Reggie walked back into the brownstone on Edgecombe Avenue. Bumpy was in the same chair. Reading a different newspaper. Well? Reggie swallowed. He said no. Bumpy didn't react. He just turned the page. Did he say why? He thinks it's a setup. He said if you have a problem, you can call him yourself. Bumpy nodded slowly. Anything else? He said he's not afraid of you. Now Bumpy looked up. There was something in his eyes that Reggie couldn't read. Not anger. Not amusement. Certainty. Thank you, Reggie. You did well. Bumpy reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. Thicker than the one Reggie had delivered earlier. For Clara. For the hospital. Reggie took it. His hands were numb. There's $300 in there, Bumpy said. The extra $100 is because I know this wasn't easy. Reggie stared at the envelope. What happens now? Bumpy folded his newspaper and set it aside. Now we wait. For what? Bumpy smiled. It was a small, sad smile. For Johnny to realize he's already lost. But what Bumpy didn't tell Reggie, what he didn't tell anyone, was that the plan had already changed. Because Johnny's refusal wasn't a surprise. It was exactly what Bumpy had been counting on. That afternoon, Johnny Davis received a phone call at the station. It wasn't from Bumpy. It wasn't from anyone in Harlem. It was from Leonard Goldstein, Vice President of Programming at WWRL. Johnny, we need to talk. My office. 4 o'clock. About what? Just be here. The line went dead. Johnny sat at his desk, staring at the phone. His producer's chair was still empty. Marcus hadn't come back. 3 other staff members had called in sick. But the show's ratings from last night were incredible. Best numbers in the station's history for that time slot. He figured Goldstein wanted to talk about the syndication deal. He was wrong. At 4 p.m., Johnny walked into Goldstein's office. The VP was behind his desk, but he wasn't alone. Two men in suits sat in the chairs across from him. They didn't stand when Johnny entered. Goldstein gestured to an empty chair. "Sit down, Johnny." Johnny sat. "What's this about?" One of the men in suits opened a briefcase and pulled out a folder. He slid it across the desk. "Do you know what this is?" the man asked. Johnny opened it. Inside were documents. Contracts. Financial statements. His confusion must have shown, because Goldstein spoke up. WWRL is funded by a consortium of investors, Johnny. We always have been. It's how we've stayed competitive in this market. Johnny looked up. "Okay." The man in the suit leaned forward. "One of our largest investors, the man who owns 38% of this station's operating capital, is named Theodore Wallace." The name meant nothing to Johnny. Theodore Wallace, the man continued, is a legitimate businessman. He owns a chain of laundromats, 2 restaurants, and a taxi dispatch service. All of it clean. All of it legal. Johnny waited. He's also Bumpy Johnson's brother-in-law. The room went cold. Johnny's mouth opened, but nothing came out. Goldstein picked up where the suit left off. "Last night, after your show, Mr. Wallace made a phone call. He didn't threaten anyone. He didn't demand anything. He simply asked a question." "What question?" "He asked if we plan to renew your contract when it expires next month." Johnny's heart was hammering now. And we told him we'd have to think about it." The second man in the suit, who hadn't spoken yet, finally did. His voice was flat. Professional. Then Mr. Wallace explained that if your contract was renewed, he would be withdrawing his investment. Not just from this station. From every venture he's involved in with our parent company. That's 4 stations across 3 states. $12 million in operating capital. Johnny stared at them. "You're firing me because of one comment?" "We're not firing you," Goldstein said. "Your contract runs through the end of the month. You'll fulfill that. But it won't be renewed. This is insane. I'm your top performer. You saw last night's ratings." "I did." Goldstein folded his hands. "And if this were just about ratings, we wouldn't be having this conversation. But it's not about ratings, Johnny. It's about infrastructure. It's about keeping the lights on." Johnny stood up. "So that's it? He makes one phone call and I'm done?" The first suit closed his briefcase. "Mr. Davis, you're not understanding the situation. This isn't punishment. This is business. Mr. Wallace didn't ask us to fire you. He didn't ask us to do anything except make a choice. And we made it. Based on what he wanted. Based on what keeps this station operational." Johnny looked at Goldstein. "You're really going to let this happen?" Goldstein met his eyes. There was something like pity there. "Johnny, I like you. You're talented. You've got a future. Just, not here. Not anymore." Johnny left the building at 4:47 p.m. He stood on the sidewalk, his mind racing. He'd been outmaneuvered. Completely. Bumpy hadn't sent anyone to threaten him. Hadn't sent anyone to hurt him. He'd just made a phone call. One phone call to the right person, and Johnny's entire career had collapsed. No violence. No confrontation. Just business. Johnny walked to the nearest payphone. He needed to think. He needed to figure out his next move. But as he reached for the phone, he saw something that made him freeze. Across the street, leaning against a lamppost, was a man in a gray coat. The man was reading a newspaper. Not looking at Johnny. Not doing anything threatening. But Johnny recognized him. He'd seen him outside the diner that morning. And outside his apartment last night. The man wasn't hiding. He wasn't pretending to be invisible. He was just there. A reminder. Johnny's hand dropped from the phone. He started walking. He didn't know where he was going. He just needed to move. But every block he walked, he saw them. Different men. Different corners. None of them approached him. None of them said a word. They were just watching. At 8 p.m., Johnny sat in his apartment with the lights off. The phone rang. He didn't answer it. It rang again. And again. On the fifth ring, he picked up. Yeah? Johnny. It was a voice he didn't recognize. Calm. Measured. There's a car waiting downstairs. You should get in it. Why would I do that? Because you still have a chance to fix this. But it expires at 9 p.m. After that, the offer is off the table. What offer? The chance to apologize. In person. Johnny's throat was dry. And if I don't? Then you keep doing what you're doing. You finish out your contract. You leave New York. You start over somewhere else. Chicago, maybe. Or Atlanta. The voice paused. But you should know that Mr. Wallace has business interests in Chicago too. And Atlanta. And Philadelphia. And it turns out, a lot of station owners take his calls. Johnny closed his eyes. The car is downstairs, the voice repeated. It will wait until 9. The line went dead. Johnny sat in the darkness, staring at the phone in his hand. He thought this was about pride. About standing up for himself. But it wasn't. It had never been. This was about showing everyone, that Bumpy Johnson didn't need to lift a finger to destroy someone. He just needed to make a phone call. And the most terrifying part? Johnny still didn't know if getting in that car would save him or finish him. Johnny got in the car at 8:53 p.m. The driver didn't speak. Didn't ask where he was going. Just pulled away from the curb and drove north. They didn't go to Red Rooster. They went to a social club on 147th Street. A place Johnny had passed 100 times but never entered. The driver opened the door. Johnny stepped out onto the sidewalk. Inside, the club was quiet. A few men played cards at a corner table. A bartender wiped down glasses. No one looked up when Johnny walked in. A man in his 50s, the same one who'd answered the door at the brownstone, gestured toward a back room. Johnny followed. Bumpy Johnson sat at a small table. No bodyguards. No weapons visible. Just an old man in a well-tailored suit, with a cup of coffee in front of him. There was one other chair. Johnny sat down. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Bumpy broke the silence. You're wondering why you're here instead of in a hospital. Johnny's mouth was dry. The thought crossed my mind. It's because you're not important enough to hurt. The words landed like a slap. Bumpy continued, his voice even and calm. You think I'm angry about what you said on the radio. I'm not. You think this is about disrespect. It's not. He took a sip of coffee. This is about teaching a lesson. Not to you. To everyone else. Johnny felt his stomach turn. You lost your job today, Bumpy said. Not because I asked them to fire you. I didn't. I asked them to make a choice. Keep you, lose me. They chose me. That's not revenge, Johnny. That's just math. So what happens now? Now you leave New York. You take whatever job you can find in whatever city will have you. And every time you sit behind a microphone, you'll remember that your career didn't end because you said something brave. It ended because you said something stupid. Bumpy set down his coffee cup. But here's the part you need to understand. The part one brought you here to here. He leaned forward slightly. You're alive right now because I decided you should be. Not because you earned it. Not because you deserved it. Because I chose it. And that choice wasn't about mercy. It was about impact. Johnny felt the words sink in. Every person in Harlem who heard what you said is watching what happens to you. They're waiting to see if the old man still has reach. If the rules still apply. And when they see you disappear, not into a grave, but into irrelevance, they'll understand something more important than fear. Bumpy sat back. They'll understand that I don't need to kill you to erase you. Johnny left the social club at 9:34 p.m. He walked back to his apartment in a daze. His phone was ringing when he opened the door. He didn't answer it. Instead, he sat at his kitchen table and opened the folder Goldstein had given him. His contract. His termination clause. The financial breakdown of his severance. 2 weeks' pay. That was it. He thought about the syndication deal. The agent in Chicago who'd been so excited. The offers that had seemed so real just 48 hours ago. He picked up the phone and called. The agent's secretary answered. I'm sorry, Mr. Davis. Mr. Brennan is no longer interested in representation. Did he say why? No, sir. He just asked me to pass along his regrets. Johnny hung up. He called the station manager in Atlanta. The one who'd wanted to bring him on for a trial run. Johnny, look. I got a call this afternoon. From an investor. I don't know how to explain this, but you don't have to. Johnny hung up again. He sat in the silence of his apartment and understood, finally, what had happened. Bumpy hadn't just taken his job. He'd taken his future. Every door that had been open yesterday was closed today. And it hadn't required violence. It hadn't required threats. Just quiet conversations with the right people. The next morning, Johnny walked into WWRL for the last time. Goldstein was waiting for him in the hallway. You don't have to finish out the month, the VP said quietly. We'll pay you through the end of your contract. But it might be easier if you just moved on. Johnny nodded. He cleaned out his desk. Took his records, his notes, his Rolodex. No one said goodbye. 1 week later, Reggie Foster stood outside the hospital in Queens. Clara had just finished her dialysis. The bills were paid. The treatment would continue. He held the envelope Bumpy had given him, now empty, and thought about Johnny. He heard Johnny left for Detroit. Some overnight shift at a small AM station. A fraction of the salary. A fraction of the audience. Reggie wondered if Johnny understood yet. Understood that this was never about punishment. It was about demonstration. And the cruelest part? Johnny would spend the rest of his career knowing that he hadn't been destroyed by violence or fear. He'd been destroyed by a quiet phone call. By business. By the realization that in Bumpy Johnson's world, you didn't need to matter enough to kill. You just needed to matter enough to forget. The story spread through Harlem in whispers. Not loud declarations. Not warnings shouted on street corners. Just quiet conversations in barbershops, laundromats, and late-night diners. You hear what happened to that radio guy? Johnny Davis? Yeah. He's gone. Gone where? Does it matter? At WWRL, the new host took Johnny's time slot within 3 days. His name was Calvin Price. Older. More careful. His first show opened with a tribute to Harlem's legacy, a carefully worded segment that praised the neighborhood's history, its resilience, its leaders past and present. He never mentioned Bumpy Johnson by name. He didn't have to. The ratings were good. Not as good as Johnny's final show. But steady. Safe. Calvin kept his job. Marcus, the producer who'd walked out mid-show, came back to work on October 22nd. No one asked where he'd been. No one mentioned that night. He sat at the control board, ran the commercials, cued the music. On his first day back, Goldstein stopped by the booth. "Good to have you back, Marcus." Marcus nodded. "Good to be back." Goldstein started to leave, then paused. "You made the right call. Walking out when you did." Marcus didn't look up from the board. "I know." At the social club on 147th Street, business continued as usual. Men came and went. Money changed hands. Deals were made. One evening, a younger man, mid-30s, sharp suit, expensive watch, sat across from Bumpy. "I heard about the radio situation," the man said. "Impressive work. Clean." Bumpy sipped his coffee. It wasn't work. It was a conversation. Still. People are talking. They're saying you still run things. People say a lot of things. The young man leaned forward. "I'm opening a new club in Brooklyn. High-end spot. I want to make sure I'm doing this right. Paying respect where it's due." Bumpy studied him for a moment. "You're not here to pay respect. You're here because you're afraid of ending up like Johnny Davis." The man's smile faltered. "Let me give you some advice," Bumpy said quietly. "Fear is useful. But it's temporary. You want to last in this business? You don't avoid stepping on toes because you're afraid. You avoid it because you're smart. What's the difference? Afraid men make mistakes when the fear goes away. Smart men make better choices when nobody's watching." The young man nodded slowly. He left an envelope on the table and stood. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Johnson." After he left, Bumpy's associate picked up the envelope. "How much?" $500. Bumpy shook his head. "Send it back." "Sir?" "He's paying out of fear. I don't want his money. I want him to remember the conversation. 3 weeks after Johnny's last show, Reggie Foster made another delivery. This time to a lawyer's office in Midtown. He handed over a sealed envelope and waited while the lawyer opened it. Inside was a cashier's check for $15,000 and a handwritten note. The lawyer read it twice, then looked up at Reggie. "This is a scholarship fund?" "Yes, sir. For students at the Harlem School of the Arts." "That's right. And it's anonymous?" "Completely." The lawyer set down the note. "Who's funding this?" Reggie didn't answer. The lawyer understood. He placed the check in his desk drawer. "Please tell your employer that we'll administer this properly." Reggie nodded and left. That night, Reggie went home to Clara. She was feeling better. The treatments were working. The color had returned to her face. "How's work?" she asked. "Quiet," Reggie said. He didn't tell her about the scholarship fund. Didn't tell her that the same man who'd erased Johnny Davis's career had just paid for a dozen kids to study music and art. Because that's what made Bumpy Johnson dangerous. Not the violence he could commit. The choices he could make. The way he could destroy someone on Monday and fund a scholarship on Tuesday, and both actions carried the same cold precision. In Detroit, Johnny Davis sat in a cramped studio at 2 a.m., reading news copy to an audience of insomniacs and long-haul truckers. The pay was $300 a week. The apartment was a fourth-floor walk-up with thin walls. Every night, he thought about that show. The one that had pulled the biggest ratings of his career. The one that had cost him everything. He tried to pitch the syndication idea to his new station manager. Tried to recapture that energy, that edge. The manager had laughed. "Johnny, you're lucky to have this shift. Don't push it." So he didn't. He read the news. Played the records. Went home. And every single night, when he sat behind the microphone, he heard Bumpy Johnson's voice in his head. "You're alive because I decided you should be." But the real aftermath, the one that mattered, wasn't happening in Detroit or at WWRL or in lawyers' offices. It was happening in the minds of everyone who'd heard what happened. The young hustlers who thought about stepping out of line. The businessmen who thought about cutting corners. The rivals who thought about making moves. They all learned the same lesson. Bumpy Johnson didn't need to be loud. He just needed to be thorough. 6 months later, Johnny Davis died in a car accident on I-75 outside Detroit. It was February 1963. Icy roads. He'd been driving home from the station after the overnight shift. His car slid into a guardrail at 4:47 a.m. The police report said he'd fallen asleep at the wheel. There was no investigation. No suspicion. Just a one-paragraph obituary in the Detroit Free Press and a closed-casket funeral attended by 11 people. His mother. A cousin. A few co-workers who barely knew him. No one from New York came. When the news reached Harlem, it traveled the same way Johnny's downfall had. Quietly. In barber shops and on street corners, people heard and nodded. Some said it was karma. Some said it was coincidence. No one said it was murder, because it wasn't. But that was the most haunting part. Bumpy Johnson had destroyed Johnny Davis so completely that when he died 6 months later, alone on a frozen highway, it didn't feel like tragedy. It felt like aftermath. Reggie Foster heard about it on a Tuesday morning. He was sitting in a diner, reading the newspaper, when he saw the small notice at the bottom of page 12. Radio personality Johnny Davis, 32, dies in accident. Reggie set down the paper. He thought about that morning in the diner. The envelope. Johnny's defiance. He thought about the choice he'd made, to tell the truth instead of lying, to protect himself instead of his friend. Clara was healthy now. The treatments had worked. They'd moved to a better apartment. Reggie had been promoted, more responsibility, better pay. He'd made the right choice. But sometimes, late at night, he still wondered if there had been another option. A third path he hadn't seen. He never found one. Bumpy Johnson learned about Johnny's death on a Wednesday. Someone mentioned it in passing at the social club. Bumpy was playing chess with an old friend. He didn't look up from the board. "That's unfortunate," he said quietly. And then he moved his knight. The game continued. Because that was the truth that Harlem understood, even if they never said it out loud. Johnny Davis hadn't died because of what he'd said on the radio. He'd died because he'd become irrelevant. Because when you stripped away someone's platform, their income, their future, when you made them a ghost in their own life, it didn't matter what happened to them after. They were already gone. Bumpy hadn't needed to touch him. Hadn't needed to threaten him. He just needed to make one phone call and let gravity do the rest. The last person to mention Johnny Davis's name in Harlem was a young DJ at WWRL in 1964. He was new. Enthusiastic. He'd been researching the station's history and found recordings of Johnny's final show. "Hey, whatever happened to this guy?" he asked Marcus, the producer. "These numbers are incredible." Marcus looked at him for a long moment. Then he took the tape out of the young DJ's hands and put it in a drawer. "He's not part of our history," Marcus said simply. "But he's not part of our history." The young DJ never asked again. And that was how Johnny Davis disappeared. Not with violence. Not with spectacle. Just with silence. A silence that started with one phone call and ended with a frozen highway and an empty funeral. The most terrifying thing about power isn't what it can destroy. It's what it can erase. Because 30 years later, no one in Harlem remembered the radio host who insulted Bumpy Johnson. They only remembered that you didn't. If this story made you think twice about the choices people make when everything's on the line, hit that subscribe button. These aren't just stories about power, they're stories about the price people pay when they forget that reputation isn't built on what you say. It's built on what you survive. More stories coming soon. End.